What do you make of this? And do you think there should be a referendum on net zero 2050?
Well, I'm pretty sure the timing is not right for a referendum. It's far too early. The parties in Westminster are adamant that there is a consensus in Parliament. But the pain might eventually grow so much that people will say, well, we have to have a say in this. And if Parliament doesn't listen, all surveys suggest that while the majority of Britons are in favour of net zero, if they have to pay for it, they are opposed to net zero. So there will be, at some point, when the pain threshold is reached, a movement for referendum, but perhaps not now.
Yeah, that is interesting. Jim, I'll throw it over to you. I mean, I know that, the surveys do tend to say that people are in favour of it. A lot of those questions are asked about, do you care about climate change? And people will go, yeah, well, I do care. But then if you ask them about, can you afford a new electric car or something like that, then the answers often are very different. I mean, would you back a referendum on net zero?
I wouldn't actually, and I don't disagree entirely with what Benny said. Actually, I know you like a little bit of disagreement from time to time on your guests, but much of what he said, I would not disagree with. Look, we had a general election back in 2019. And that general election for the four major parties, including the SNP in Scotland, all backed net zero in their manifestos. They, in one form or another, all got elected as MPs, so that's what we're going forward. What we're getting at the moment is a few fringe MPs on the right of the Tory party and Reform UK who are pushing for this agenda. It's already been voted for. We don't need to go back on it, much the same with Brexit, I guess. That would be the argument there. We've already been and done it. That's what's put forward. So I don't think this needs to be done. You might think, Patrick, that as a meteorologist, I might be quite happy about a referendum that probably would return a big yes vote. The last time I looked at a poll, there was 73% in favour, as Benny's already suggested, heavily in favour. But I just think this is a little bit of a red herring, if you like. I think this will happen. The general election is going to come before.
Yeah, I just wonder, Benny, whether or not, as you've said, in terms of the actual cost, so when people see the reality of it, then that's what a referendum for me would really drill down on, because it would really put the issue absolutely front and centre, and people would go, right, this is the actual day-to-day cost of it for you going forward. And you think, Benny, do you, that if people were confronted by that they would actually vote against net zero? Why? Outline that for us.
Well, first of all, it's not entirely clear what the referendum would be about. There are, a number of issues. It's the date of net zero. Remember, most of the world doesn't have a date at all. They don't have any legally binding targets. So it's just basically Europe. Even the US doesn't have a binding target. The Chinese don't have a binding. No one has a binding target apart from the Europeans. So this is one issue. But can I just say about the kind of all-party consensus on net zero? Philip Hammond, who was the Chancellor under Theresa May, said all ministers and prime ministers have misled the public about the cost of net zero. So the Parliament has been misled. The country has been misled. No one had a voice to scrutinise the cost issue. That's what I'm saying.
Can you just give me a couple of figures, Benny, before I throw it over to Jim then? What do you mean about being misled? Come on, what are these numbers?
Well, you remember or may not remember that Philip Hammond, as a Chancellor, wrote to Theresa May and said this will be painfully expensive. I think he came up with an estimate of £1 trillion by 2050. In reality, it's more like 3 or 4 trillion pounds.
Right.
So we're talking tens of thousands of pounds per household. Okay. And he said that ministers and prime ministers did not want to know about the cost issue.
Right, well, there we go then, Jim. I suppose that, if those figures are right, that is the kind of thing that would make people change their minds about voting for a party that backed net zero, no?
Yeah, that's the old red rag to a bull situation. Let's just say this. It's the cost of not doing net zero that's going to be the expensive one. Deloitte, who are a big city firm, I think the global, they came up with figures for not doing net zero in terms of the next up to 2050 and suggested, and you can see this happening this year, Patrick, in terms of the various weather stroke climate events that have been going on, huge cataclysmic events in certain circumstances, but they worked out that it was going to be something in the region of $170 trillion in terms of not going in this direction. So the small side of it of evolving in towards net zero by 2050 or whatever date we actually get there pales into insignificance in terms of the costs of not doing that and facing what the climate is going to deliver.
Well, that's a pretty good rebuttal, Benny. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, if it comes to a referendum, and I'm pretty sure at some point, if the Parliament doesn't listen to the vast majority of Britons who are concerned about the individual policies of net zero, if Parliament doesn't listen, we will eventually come to a situation where there will be a movement like the Brexit referendum movement, where the
but what Jim said there is the cost of not doing anything.
These are, I mean, let's face it. First of all, the idea that we're not doing anything is, of course, ridiculous. Of course, countries are doing a lot. The question is, what do you do? What do you prioritize? It's not about doing something or nothing. It's what should we do that is cost-effective, that makes sense, and that we can deal with climate change.
But is the problem that urgent for you, Benny? That's the thing, isn't it? Because if what Jim is saying there is correct, that's if, the catastrophe happens, right? I mean, do you think it is going to happen?
Look, obviously, I'm not thinking that the catastrophe is happening. In fact, if you look at the cost of weather-related disasters, the costs overall compared to the rise of GDP have actually dropped over the last 30 years, so the costs have come down rather than... But this is something that needs to be addressed and scrutinized. These figures are very misleading.
Well, Jim, I'll let you come back to that, and I will also just gently nudge you in the direction of, is there no way that human technology between now and 2050 can just solve all of our problems, and we can have flood defences and all of this stuff? Go on.
I think you're right in that there is an evolving situation where technology will hopefully come to the rescue at some point. I mean, it already is to a certain degree. Benny's right with that. It's not that we're not doing nothing. The world, certain countries are moving faster than others. What we don't want is a government that we've got, which is basically rolling backwards, not quite knowing what it's doing for whatever reason, and falling to politics rather than common sense. And I think if we all got the common sense, we might actually evolve in the right direction at a pace that may not keep up with climate change. We've seen what's happened this summer in various places and what's ongoing. For example, now the China floods that's going to be occurring. You'll probably see a bit more news about that in the next week or two. So all of this is kind of, the agenda, the conversation, the communication is going to continue on and on and on. And it's just as Sunak actually gets a backbone and does anything about it whatsoever.